At 78, Lorraine's eyes still sparkle when she talks about her morning piano sessions and the wild flowers she tends with aching but grateful hands. She wasn't always this grounded. It took years and some deep regrets to become the woman who now walks into each day with purpose, not apology. But what if you didn't have to wait decades to find that clarity? In this video, I'll share 4 things I wish I had done sooner, and what you can do now to avoid the same regrets. Let's begin with the first. 1. She used to stay silent, and it cost her more than she realized. Lorraine's calm now is hard-earned. Before she discovered the strength in her own voice, she spent decades keeping the peace by keeping herself small. If someone cut in line, she smiled. If she was interrupted mid-sentence, she laughed it off. If her heart said no, but the world expected yes, she agreed anyway, not out of weakness, but out of habit. Generational teachings like don't stir the pot, be agreeable, and let it go, shaped her early years like invisible blueprints. But that kind of silence builds weight. It seeps into the bones. Lorraine began to notice it most in her 50s, tightness in the chest that wasn't medical, tears that surfaced after minor conversations, a quiet frustration that followed her to bed. It wasn't that she had anything specific to complain about, it was that she had stopped expressing anything at all. She wasn't alone. Many women her age had done the same, raised in households where emotional needs weren't voiced, only endured. The idea of setting boundaries felt foreign, even rude. Speaking up felt risky. So, like many others, she swallowed her discomfort and wore a polite smile for years. Until, one afternoon, something shifted. It was small, almost invisible to anyone else. Her neighbor had asked her to babysit, again, for the 3rd weekend in a row. Lorraine looked down at her tea, heart thudding. She was exhausted, but guilt pressed hard on her chest. Still, something inside her said, not this time. She looked up and said, I actually need this weekend for myself. No apology, no lengthy excuse, just honesty. The world didn't end. Her neighbor said, oh, of course. And just like that, Lorraine had broken the cycle. She began experimenting with this new muscle. When a friend interrupted her mid-story, she said gently, let me finish that thought. When someone dismissed her hobby as just a pastime, she replied, it brings me peace. And that's not small. Each time, her confidence grew. She wasn't combative, she was clear. There's a difference, and it mattered. Lorraine even began writing out phrases she wished she'd used decades ago. I'm not comfortable with that. That doesn't work for me. I hear you, but I disagree. Practicing these out loud in the mirror, she retrained her tongue and reclaimed her voice. Lorraine had worried, like many women do, that asserting herself would damage relationships, but what she found was the opposite. Friends began respecting her time more, conversations became more honest, and she attracted new connections who appreciated her clarity and authenticity. She used to feel drained after social visits, unsure why. Now she realized it was because she had been shape-shifting, agreeing when she didn't, smiling when she didn't feel joy, extending herself when she had nothing left to give. But when she began drawing lines, softly, kindly, she discovered people who didn't just stay, they leaned in. One friend even said, I admire how sure of yourself you are now. That comment stayed with her, because confidence wasn't something she had, it was something she earned through practice, through small brave moments, like saying, I need rest, or that doesn't sit well with me. She found new rituals to support this self-expression. A morning journal prompt, what do I really feel today? A nighttime review, did I speak my truth today, or hold it in? Slowly, she began trusting her instincts again, not just recognizing them, but honoring them. The biggest surprise wasn't how others reacted, it was how she transformed. Lorraine used to describe herself as sensitive, but now she saw that sensitivity wasn't weakness, it was insight. She had just needed to pair it with courage. Once she began speaking up, other areas of her life began to shift. She stopped saying yes to every volunteer request, and instead chose projects that truly mattered to her. she began painting again, something she'd loved in her 20s but abandoned out of fear that it wasn't good enough. She reached out to her sister to revisit a decades-old wound, not to blame, but to finally say how it had felt. The ripple effect was unmistakable. She stood taller, her energy changed, even her sleep improved. Lorraine often says now, "If I could go back, I'd tell my younger self this: you don't need to be loud to be heard. You just need to be honest with yourself first." And that honesty, it changed everything. 2. She noticed the little signals, but ignored them for too long. Gaining the confidence to speak her truth gave Lorraine a new kind of self-awareness, but it also made her realize how often she had brushed aside physical discomfort, fatigue, and emotional heaviness over the years. For decades, she believed what many of us are told: push through it, it's normal, it'll pass. But her body had been whispering, gently, and then not so gently. For years, there were signs, small ones at first. She had started waking up with stiffness in her knees, chalked it up to just aging, and moved on. Some days, she felt unusually tired, even after a full night's sleep. Occasionally, her heart would flutter strangely after climbing stairs, and she'd brush it off as nerves or dehydration. But the whispers didn't go away. They grew louder, and eventually became things she couldn't ignore: dizzy spells, rising blood pressure, foggy memory, and long stretches of sadness she didn't talk about. Looking back, Lorraine realized she didn't lack awareness. She lacked permission to pause, to investigate, to care. Health for her generation had often been about survival and duty. You didn't complain, you kept going. But now she understood, being strong also means being still enough to listen. Lorraine didn't have a heart attack. She wasn't rushed to the hospital. There was no dramatic collapse. Her wake-up moment came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, sitting at her kitchen table. She opened a jar of jam, and couldn't grip the lid properly. Her hand trembled. A wave of irritation passed over her, but then something deeper followed: fear, not panic. Just a quiet realization that she didn't feel like herself anymore, and she hadn't, for a while. That day, she took out a notebook and wrote down every little thing she'd been ignoring: dry skin that wouldn't go away, mood swings she chalked up to weather, sleep that never felt deep. The list stunned her, not because any single thing was alarming, but because the total picture was undeniable. Her body had been asking for help in whispers, and now, she was ready to answer. This shift didn't come with a gym membership or drastic diet. Lorraine knew herself. She needed simple, sustainable steps, things she could do consistently, without overwhelming herself. The goal wasn't to become younger, it was to feel aligned again, to feel present in her own body, not like a visitor passing through it. Lorraine's first step was hydration. Not glamorous, but real. She realized she drank more tea than water, something she never questioned. She began tracking her water intake, and added a pinch of sea salt to her morning glass, to help absorption. The fog in her head, it began to lift. Her energy, once reserved in cautious sips, came back in waves. She didn't feel like sprinting, she felt like moving again. Next came movement, not structured classes or rigid routines, just stretching by her window each morning. At first, she held each stretch for 5 seconds, then 10. She found a rhythm that matched her breath. It became less about flexibility, and more about reclaiming connection. For years she had moved for others, for work, for house chores, for family. Now she moved for herself. She also introduced something she called quiet meals. No distractions, no phone, no TV, just her plate, and gratitude. It slowed her eating, deepened her enjoyment, and revealed patterns, like how often she rushed meals, or skipped them altogether. Food stopped being a background activity. It became a moment of nourishment, both physical and emotional. 3 months into her new habits, Lorraine didn't feel like a new person. She felt like herself, returned. Her joints still ached sometimes. Her energy still dipped in the afternoons. But the difference was how she responded. She no longer ignored her bump. She partnered with it. She began scheduling checkups without delay, brought her questions to her doctor without minimizing them, and finally acknowledged the lingering grief that was affecting her appetite and sleep. She also became more vocal in conversations about aging. At her community center, she started gently challenging the phrase, "just getting old." Instead, she asked, "What if this is our body's way of asking for something different?" People listened. She found joy in knowing that small steps added up. She didn't need to overhaul her entire lifestyle. She only needed to honor what her body had been saying all along. That changed how she walked, how she breathed, how she rested, and more importantly, it changed how she believed in herself. Listening to her health signals wasn't just about avoiding illness, it was about reestablishing trust with her own body, her own rhythms, her own needs. That trust, it became the foundation for everything that followed. 3. Letting go of just in case. With healthier routines in place, and her body beginning to feel like a partner again, Lorraine's attention shifted to something that had quietly been draining her for years: her surroundings. Her home was comfortable, lived in, and full of memories, but it was also full of just-in-case items, unopened gifts, expired canned goods, a drawer full of cords she couldn't name, 3 sets of measuring cups, and a closet bursting with clothes she no longer wore. These weren't mistakes, they were stories. That coat from her sister who passed years ago, the figurines from a friend who no longer called, the unopened puzzle meant for a winter that never felt quiet enough. Lorraine didn't see clutter, she saw attachment, but she also began noticing something else: the invisible weight these items carried. Each drawer that stuck, each closet that needed rearranging to find one thing, each shelf that overflowed, wasn't just a storage issue, it was a signal. She was still holding on, not for utility, but for memory, guilt, or fear of forgetting. Decluttering wasn't about tidying, it became emotional archaeology, and for the first time, she wondered what she might discover if she made space not for things, but for peace. Lorraine began with a simple rule: keep what makes you smile, store what makes you sigh. She took out a box, small enough to carry, beautiful enough to matter, and began placing items inside that she wasn't ready to part with, but didn't need to see every day. Photos of friends she'd lost, the scarf her mother knit, a letter from a child she tutored decades ago. Each item held a layer of her life, but instead of leaving them scattered across drawers and shelves, she gave them a home, deliberate and dignified. This shift allowed her to grieve without drowning in nostalgia. She wasn't erasing anything, she was honoring it with clarity. Once these memory boxes were complete, she found herself pausing in front of them now and then, not out of sadness, but reflection. She didn't feel buried in the past anymore, she felt connected to it. It also gave her emotional permission to let go of what didn't belong. The broken lamp from her first apartment, gone. The set of mismatched holiday plates, donated. As she made these decisions, the weight began to lift, first from her home, then from her heart. Physical clutter was one thing, emotional clutter was another. Lorraine had been carrying unresolved conversations, silent resentments, and old self-blame, like invisible boxes stacked on her back. She had replayed certain moments for years: what she should have said, who she should have become, where she might have gone if only. But now that her outer world was becoming lighter, the noise inside became louder, and this time she didn't run from it. She began writing letters, never sent, just written. One to her father, who never said, "I'm proud of you." One to her younger self, who tried so hard to be perfect. One to a friend who had vanished after a falling out that never healed. Some of these letters were angry, some sorrowful. Most began with, "I never told you," but by the time she finished, what remained was not just release, it was understanding. She also practiced sitting with silence, not to meditate but to feel. Just 10 minutes each evening, hands open, eyes closed. Some nights she wept, some nights she smiled, but each time she came out feeling clearer, like she was no longer storing emotional boxes in a corner no one could see. By spring, Lorraine's home looked the same to visitors, but it felt different. There was more air in the room, more light on the walls, more ease in how she moved through each space, and more importantly, she no longer delayed or avoided everyday decisions. She stopped keeping broken things. If a chair creaked and couldn't be fixed, it went. If she hadn't worn something in a year, it left. If a book no longer resonated, she passed it along. But the most important shift wasn't visible. It was how she handled emotions. When regret crept in, she met it with grace. When sadness visited, she didn't bury it. She gave it space. And when joy arrived, she let it stay as long as it wanted. Lightness wasn't about minimalism. It was about alignment. Every choice to release, whether a chipped mug or a painful memory, made room for something else. Laughter on the phone, quiet mornings without guilt, deeper rest. Lorraine's space no longer felt like a storage unit of her past. It felt like a reflection of her present. And every time she walked through her home, she was reminded she had made room for herself. For the someday list had been waiting long enough. With her home lighter and her emotions clearer, Lorraine began waking with a different energy. Still quiet but expectant, she had come far. She no longer ignored her needs, and she had learned to release what no longer belonged in her physical or emotional world. But one part of her still remained unexplored, the dreams she had deferred. At the back of a kitchen drawer sat a list, written years ago, perhaps decades, titled Someday. It included things like, take a watercolor class, visit the rose garden in the next town over, write a letter to the editor, learn to bake sourdough, and call her childhood friend. They were simple wishes, but they had been ignored in favor of duty, fear, or the illusion of perfect timing. For years, Lorraine believed joy had prerequisites: better health, fewer responsibilities, the right company. But now, standing in the quiet of a morning with nothing urgent pressing, she saw the truth: joy waits only for permission. She didn't rewrite the list, she just circled 3 items, and that week she signed up for the watercolor class she had once walked past 50 times. It wasn't a declaration, it was a quiet decision to stop postponing herself. Lorraine had grown up believing that happiness had to be earned. You finished your chores first, you got the work done before play, you put everyone else's needs ahead of your own. Only then, if there was time, could you enjoy something for yourself. But now, at 78, she began questioning that rhythm. What if joy wasn't a reward, but a need? What if doing something delightful, without proving she deserved it, was actually the most radical act of self-respect? She started weaving small joys into her routine without justification, playing music while washing dishes, buying the nice soap instead of the one on sale, sitting in the sun for 20 minutes just because it felt good. At first, a quiet voice would still whisper, "You haven't done enough today," but she didn't argue with it, she just smiled and kept going. Slowly, that voice got quieter. Lorraine's joy didn't look like adventure or noise, it looked like little rituals: making tea in her favorite cup, painting leaves on a postcard, dancing slowly in the hallway when no one was watching. It wasn't extravagant, but it was consistent. And in that consistency, she realized, she didn't have to earn joy. She just had to let it in. Completing old goals and reclaiming joy naturally pulled Lorraine outward. She didn't force social interactions. She simply became more open. At her watercolor class, she complimented another woman's color choices. They chatted after class. By the 3rd session, they were walking out together, talking about the things they missed and the things they were starting again. Lorraine didn't feel the need to overshare. She wasn't performing connection, she was receiving it. She signed up for a weekly community walk. At first she didn't say much, but people remembered her name. They waved. One woman offered to bring her a homemade snack the next week. These gestures weren't grand, but they mattered. For years, Lorraine had assumed new relationships were for the young, or at least for the newly retired, but she was reminded that openness doesn't age. She also reconnected with her cousin through a birthday card. They hadn't spoken in 10 years. Lorraine didn't write a long message, just a few lines and an old photo. A phone call came a week later. They laughed, they cried, and they promised not to let another decade slip by. Connection, she realized, didn't require perfect timing. Just one moment of reaching out was enough to begin. What began as a watercolor class became something deeper. Lorraine started painting postcards for her grandchildren. Not just birthday cards, everyday ones. A bluebird in spring, a sunrise she saw from her porch, a memory from her childhood, painted in soft strokes. She didn't care if they looked good, they felt real. And with each one, she rediscovered a version of herself that had long been buried beneath responsibility. She wrote short reflections in a journal, not for publication, but to capture what she called emotional snapshots. A moment of laughter, a hard decision made, a peaceful evening. Creativity wasn't about producing, it was about presence. This shift touched everything. She styled her meals with care, rearranged furniture to create space for a small painting nook, started humming while she cooked. Her home felt more like her. Creativity gave her freedom, not to escape life, but to engage with it more fully. Each creative act became proof that she was still becoming, still blooming, still deeply capable of beauty. Lorraine often said, "I don't create because I'm talented, I create because I'm alive." And that truth, more than anything, completed her return to herself. With each habit, Lorraine didn't change who she was, she remembered. Her voice grew stronger, her body wiser, her space clearer, and her spirit lighter. These final steps, the courage to choose joy, to reach out, to create without judgment, didn't just complete the circle, they opened it. She no longer saw aging as a closing chapter. It was a rediscovery, a quiet revolution of returning to the parts of herself that had waited patiently to be lived. And now, with every sunrise, she no longer asked, "What should I do?" Instead, she whispered, "What do I want to feel today?" 5. She created a weekly rhythm that nourished every part of her, with new joy, clarity, and creativity pulsing through her days. Lorraine realized she wasn't simply doing better, she was living differently. But something inside her wanted to make it last, not as a checklist, but as a rhythm, a living pattern she could return to again and again. She took a simple sheet of paper and wrote down what grounded her emotionally, physically, and mentally: her morning stretch, her painting corner, her silent tea time, and her walks with friends. Then, rather than stuffing these practices into random pockets of the week, she gave them names: her Monday move, Tuesday tea, Friday flow. These weren't rules, they were invitations. Every week, she rotated gentle routines with intention. Mondays became about movement and breath. Tuesdays, about reflection and writing. Wednesdays, about social time, even if it was a 5-minute call. Thursdays, she decluttered one drawer or shelf. Fridays, she painted or simply sat in stillness. This rhythm created something deeper than routine. It built an inner compass. When life felt overwhelming, she knew where to return. When a week was busy, she didn't feel guilt, just quiet acknowledgement that the rhythm would wait for her. She didn't call it a schedule. She called it "my gentle loop," and it kept her centered, even when the world pulled in different directions. Throughout her journey, Lorraine had worked through many layers of self-doubt, but there was one final layer to face: the quiet, invisible pressure to get it right. Even after making major emotional changes, she'd sometimes catch herself slipping into the old habit of measuring her worth by productivity, or comparing her pace to others. One evening, after missing 2 days of her gentle loop, she felt disappointment creeping in. But instead of retreating, she sat down and made a list, not of what she hadn't done, but of what she had. Small wins. She drank her water. She made space for grief when a memory surfaced. She answered a difficult phone call. It was in that moment she realized the power of tracking her emotional and mental growth, not for performance, but for remembrance. She began keeping what she called a progress log, not of perfect habits, but of honest moments. Times she spoke up, times she rested instead of pushed, times she chose joy over guilt. That shift changed everything. The log wasn't about streaks, it was about truth. She saw patterns emerging. Certain weeks were heavier, certain triggers still stung, but she also saw her strength in motion. Progress became less about perfection and more about presence. This celebration of enoughness became her anchor. She no longer chased ideal days, she honored real ones. With these layered habits, anchoring her in voice, health, clarity, joy, and rhythm, Lorraine's transformation felt full, but not finished. She no longer sought arrival, she welcomed evolution. She found herself asking new questions. Not what have I missed, but what could still surprise me. Not what did I lose, but what haven't I discovered yet. These weren't urgent questions, they were expansive ones, rooted in trust. That spring, she picked up a library card again, and began reading about topics she'd never explored: astronomy, bird migrations, even digital art, not to master them, just to see what sparked something. She began leaving space in her weekly rhythm for new light, time for something unfamiliar. Some weeks, it was a new recipe, others it was sitting in a new spot at the park. She didn't push herself, she simply created space. A half hour here, a walk in a different direction there. Each new experience gently reminded her that she wasn't done growing. Her transformation wasn't a closed loop, it was an open spiral, one that curved inward when needed, and outward when invited. What came next didn't need a name or a goal, it just needed permission. And that, she had finally learned to give herself, freely and fully. Lorraine's journey began with regret, but it bloomed into something more, a life reclaimed, through simple, deliberate, emotionally resonant habits. She hadn't rushed or forced change. She moved slowly, bravely, and truthfully. Each step, finding her voice, listening to her body, letting go of clutter, choosing joy, nurturing rhythm, celebrating progress, and creating space, had become a thread in a tapestry of transformation. And now that tapestry didn't just reflect her past. It held space for who she was still becoming, because growth doesn't end with age, it deepens. And the quiet habits we choose each day, they're how we become the women we were always meant to be. At 78, Lorraine didn't rewrite her past. She reclaimed her present through small, soulful shifts. She found clarity, confidence, and joy. Your path can begin today. With each habit, you're not just changing routines, you're choosing yourself, and that choice is always right on time.